Well, welcome to the 37th episode of Ideas and Lives, where we talk to people about who have interesting careers and compelling ideas, and we trace the arc of their careers and how they're thinking about the world today. I'm Bob Lerman, a social policy economist, and my co-host is Zvi Bodie.
Zvi Bodie, friend of Bob Lerman's and a financial economist. Retired.
Very good. And today I'm extremely pleased that we have my good friend Doug Besharov, close friend and former tennis partner until I get better, and just an all-around thoughtful person about social policy. So this is not finance. We've interviewed a number of finance people. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Bob. And come back to the tennis court.
Okay. Doug is a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and he's had a very interesting career. So before we get to the career, Doug, tell us about how you grew up, what your parents did, where you come from, and so on.
Well, you know, in the nomenclature of today's social policy, I was raised by a single mother. My father died before I was 2. Single mother and a grandmother, so we were technically what they call a 3-generational household. We were not poor as nails, but we were pretty poor. So I didn't have my own room. I shared it with my grandmother. I didn't have my own room until I went to law school. So there you are.
Did you have any siblings, or was just you were the only child?
Only child.
Okay. And you lived in New York?
Yeah, Flushing, New York, about 4 miles, maybe 6, I don't know, from where our erstwhile Republican nominee is, Donald Trump. So just to make a side comment, I don't know where Zvi grew up. Okay, Zvi, you must have grown up in New York.
Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah. So a lot of what Trump says, right, the way he sounds, is not foreign to my ears, and it's not crazy. It is just the way New Yorkers talk, in hyperbole and with a little bit of poetic license. I mean, I'm not trying to defend him at all, but it's just so striking to hear somebody who sounds like my childhood. That's all.
Yeah. So you grew up and you went to high school in Flushing?
No. Brooklyn Tech.
Oh, me too.
Yes, I know. You forget.
I forgot.
And Lenny Hausman was there too, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You guys were the big men on campus. And look at what happened. We little guys caught up.
You certainly did.
So what years were you there, Zvi?
Excuse me?
What years were you there?
Years 1956 to 60.
Okay, I was 58 to 62. So you were 2 years
close.
ahead of me. Yeah. We overlapped a little bit.
It was still an all-boys school.
Yeah, Tech alma mater, molder of men.
Right.
So you were into what we today call STEM, science, technology, engineering, math.
Yeah, but tech was that plus voc ed. So Zvi and I both know how to work a machine lathe. We both know how to pour molten iron or something. I don't know, whatever we poured. So we did technical drawing, right, Zvi? So we did a lot of things like that.
Technical drawing of 4 years of technical drawing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
I
so it was
wonder
a
if they
very
still,
different kind of education. Yeah,
wonder if they still do that at Brooklyn Tech, but
it's a terrific school. Even, you know, it may be even better now because I think the kids are even smarter. There's, as you may know, this big battle about the specialized schools.
yeah,
The irony is that kids at Tech are the furthest thing from white, and they're the furthest thing from affluent or privileged. It's
yeah.
just that because of our crummy schools, there just aren't a lot of blacks or Latinos. And to me, that's a school issue. It's not a family issue or anything
Yeah.
else. But anyway, so it's a terrific school.
So then you're thinking about presumably college, or you could have gone into dealing with lathes, but you decided to go to college.
Yeah, big mistake. I could be making more money now if I were, become an electrical engineer. My goodness gracious. Yeah.
Or a
So,
computer
so where
scientist.
did you go?
So first member of my generation to go to college. I just being silly, excuse me, but yeah, so I went to Queens College. As I said, we were not wealthy. And the schools I got into weren't prepared to cover all my costs. And there weren't what we have now, which is student loans to get you into overwhelming debt and so forth. So you really had to have money in the bank. So I biked to Queens College.
Okay, and how was that? How did you enjoy Queens College?
Well, it was, I think, 70% women.
That sounds good.
Yeah, so do I have to go any further than that? It was a great school. It was as I think it still is, it was selective. The people who were there wanted to be there. One of the reasons why there were so many women, I don't know about, I don't know where V went, but
Brooklyn College.
so for us, the boys in the families went to, quote, a better school. The families put the money into the boys who could have a, dormitory someplace, and the girls had to live at home. That was sort of the economics of all that. So it was bright people. Selected, the faculty was fabulous. The faculty was still left over from the Depression days. So we're a lot of older people who were really fabulous academics. Not a lot of researchers, but we had one of the best string quartets in the country. And I took a course on, of all things, string quartets, chamber music. I'm not a musician. I'm almost tone deaf. But I learned a lot about string quartets, and I learned a lot about Beethoven, and it was a lot of fun. And I don't use that now. I use that knowledge more often than I use geometry, but not by much.
There you go. So, so what was your major? What were the highlights of your college?
So I was political science, because every other major, if I remember correctly, you had to take 36 credits in your major. And political science, you only had to take 24. So that let me be a little bit of a dilettante. That let me take courses in sociology and so forth, and in chamber music and so forth. I mean, so college, since it was a sleepaway college, not a sleepaway, live-at-home college, and I worked every afternoon. I worked from 4 to 9 every day.
What was your job?
I used to fix TVs.
Okay.
Yeah. Used to make the home visits, with this big box of bulbs and, tubes,
Wow.
so forth.
So that was applied. Was that based on Brooklyn technology?
No, I mean, I'd love to say yes. But TVs in those days, there were only a few things, well, there were serious things that could go bad, like a capacitor or something, and I didn't touch those things. But 90% of the problems in a TV in those days were just having to change a tube. You had to know which tubes would go out. If you looked, you often could tell a screen would look floating or whatever, and you knew exactly what tube that was going to be. And the other thing that the TVs used to do, and I never quite understood it, but they had the channel selector. If you ever took a TV apart, did you ever take one apart, Steve?
No.
So it's a cylinder with all these little metal studs or whatever that match up, and as you turn them, they match a different station and so forth, and they would get tarnished. So there were two ways to fix it, which is you could take it into the shop and spend a lot of money on it, or you could unscrew it, get a pencil eraser and erase the studs, the tarnish off the studs, and put it back in. And we used to charge an immense amount of money for that little procedure. You know, it just, you're getting me going. It's just, I'm being a little silly, and we can talk about something more serious, but you know, when we talk about inflation and the cost of living and so forth, forget about the fact that the TVs were much more expensive than today and not nearly as good. But we rarely left a home visit to fix a TV for under $75. Now, this is a long time ago.
Yeah,
I don't know that would have been worth now. It was really expensive to fix a TV, and they broke.
yeah. So then did you go from college directly to law school, or what?
Yeah. And I went to NYU.
Now, those were the days, let's see, you would have graduated in what, 66, 67?
No. So I was, let's see, high school was class of 58, college was class of 58, 62, 60, I graduated in 65. Yeah, so 66, yeah.
And that was a period where Vietnam might have played a role.
Yeah, sorry about this phone. Yeah, someone's got to pick it up. That was Vietnam, but more importantly than that, it was a civil rights movement, which I was quite active in. So, so in college, you know, I was an exchange student with Talladega College in the South. In fact, I was there the night of President Johnson's "We Shall Overcome" speech on a HBC campus. It was quite exciting until they started shooting at us. And then came Vietnam. Yeah, so I can tell you about Vietnam too.
So you
but
were
I
in
do want to
the
mention
South
that I was
working to improve opportunities for Black Americans.
That and more. Essentially, I was in Mississippi one summer. This was the summer immediately after the voting rights bill passed. So we're not talking about opportunity. We're just trying to get people registered to vote. My job was, whenever I could, to get young Blacks to vote, just register. And so my car broke down, took it in to be fixed. And my job was to say, are you registered to vote? No, they weren't. So I took a caravan, this is true, of about 5 cars, maybe 25 Black guys. All guys, I don't mean, you know. And we went down to the federal registrar and they all signed up. Those were heady days. No ambiguity, gentlemen. No ambiguity about policy choices. It was.
Yeah. And
I
how
can tell
long
you
did
more
you
and
work?
more, but yeah.
How long did you work on that?
So I was active in that for a couple of years. Yeah. There was so much.
So
Yeah.
how did Vietnam figure in law school and everything? How did all this mix of things? Yeah, you did civil rights work, but that didn't necessarily exempt you from the Army.
Well, that's a long story. And I mean, if I tell it fully, like a politician, I might get in trouble. So let me give you a truncated and not exactly fully truthful version of this, if you don't mind.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
I tried to get into the Army in college because everybody went. If you remember, there was a draft, and
Yeah.
this is before the war started, and everybody had to go in and serve whatever it was, 2 years or whatever. And you could, if you went in while in college, they'd pay for your law school, and you'd only have to do another 2 years. And when you served for 4 years, you'd serve as an officer. So I tried to get in, and I was rejected for physical reasons. So you know where this story, you're looking at me. Yeah, I'm pretty active, but they found something wrong enough that they weren't going to let me in.
Mm.
And it hasn't held me up and all that sort of stuff. But then as the war got more heated, then all of a sudden my physical problems became less serious to the Army.
Mm.
And so then they wanted me.
Mhm.
And by this time I was just about to graduate law school. I was married. They weren't even the marriage exemptions anymore. So at that point, I appealed and appealed and appealed and avoided the draft on the grounds that of my original physical condition. But it was a battle. It's, you know.
But anyway, so you didn't have to worry then about the Army after college. You chose then to go to law school. How did that happen?
Well, you know, we were all idealists in those days. And in those days, 60–80% of the national merit whatevers or something like that went to law school. They don't do that anymore. Then for a while it was business school. But in our generation, law school was one of the places you went to, quote, do good. So I wanted to do good. I wanted to do civil rights work and so forth. So it was natural to want to go to law school.
How did you like law school?
Well, I was still working. I was working. You know, this is one of the things that makes me think about student loans. But so I worked from my first year, I worked every day from, I think it was 2 in the afternoon until 5:30 in the downtown insurance company. And then on weekends, I fixed TVs again. Now it's not like I had to make a lot of money to avoid debt, because if I remember correctly, and I didn't look this up, but I'm pretty sure this is right. I think my calendar year tuition was $1,600, as opposed to whatever it is now, 80,000, something of that.
This is in law school.
Yeah. In college, they finally put in a fee when I was there. So it was $24.
Yeah.
A semester.
Also, Brooklyn College was also maybe $100.
Yeah. Well, you got a better.
But anyway, what about the courses? How did you feel about the law school courses, the general environment?
Oh, I was not good in law school. So this was a very exciting time. This was the Warren Court. It was the Warren Court? Anyway, it was the liberal court.
Warren Court, yes.
And we got one liberal decision after another.
Yeah.
And these were all taken as wonderful things in the environment I was in. And me too. I mean, I wasn't some kind of, you know, Federalist Society person or anything. But in retrospect, it's quite striking. We moved the law sharply to the left in those years. And now we're moving the law sharply or whatever to the right. But in those years, it was quite exciting. I remember my contracts professor telling me that he had been given a case on the right to a pre-trial hearing on evidence that might be suppressed. And he was a contracts lawyer. And he said, I took it as a favor to Norm Dorset. Norm was on our faculty, he was the head of the ACLU and all that sort of stuff. That took the case as a favor. And I was completely surprised when the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, because it was sort of one of these left field, what's the Supreme Court doing ruling on this minutiae of criminal practice? Anyway, so it was very exciting. I had difficulty. First of all, I was working a lot, so I just couldn't study as much as other people. I'm not saying I would have done better if I didn't work. Well, I did better after I got married and didn't work, but I didn't have the time. But you had to memorize rules that didn't make a lot of sense to me. I never understood the antitrust rules. And now I explain that by the fact that they're all gone because they made no sense, right? But we took them. We didn't take them with a grain of salt. That was the way it was, and only slowly.
So then,
yeah.
After graduating, you took the bar in New York, or what?
Yeah. We all so. Since I was still kind of free from the draft, I was able to work in law. Many of my friends, to avoid the draft, became school teachers, K-12. And that was the way they avoided the draft, because there was always an exemption for K-12 teachers, at least in my world. So, but I went to work for John Lindsay. And I say for John Lindsay because I worked.
You mean the mayor's office, or?
Yeah, in City Hall with John and his. I only had maybe 10 interactions with him over a period of 4 months, but I worked with him and it was quite exciting.
What was your job?
All right, for any of your listeners and for you, if you've ever gotten a ticket. And basically not a parking ticket, and basically not had an easy way to contest it, that's because of me. Now, I haven't done a lot of famous things, okay, don't get me wrong, but I am the single originator of something called the Parking Violations Bureau. In New York City, we are the first ones who made parking a civil violation, not a criminal. It used to be a criminal violation. And we made it that you could pay it by mail and so forth. And we did it. We made it so it was much easier to enforce. And it got adopted by most states in the next couple of years. So I did that. Yeah, that was quote, an accomplishment.
And then what was your next job after working in the Lindsay office?
So I went to the Corporation Counsel's office because as a whatever. And I went to the division that did litigation for housing violations, for pornography. I helped prosecute a couple of the shows on Broadway. I mean, you should ask me about that, because it really shows you the way government, when the power of government is abused, it's quite striking. And then I became the head of the juvenile division. And I was the head of an office that prosecuted juvenile homicides, child abuse, child support, your area. So I've probably seen more child support cases than you have, Bob.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And family and spouse abuse. Yeah.
So that gave you a whole insight into the whole social welfare system to some extent, or some of the social problems too.
Yeah. I think what I would say is, so I think I believe a lot of the problems for Black Americans come from both slavery, but even more so Jim Crow. So I'm a believer in root causes and all that sort of stuff. But what my experience showed me is, regardless of what the root causes might be, some people can be pretty mean and can be pretty dangerous. And it's just fine to say, and I don't mean to pick a scab or anything. It's fine. It's important to say that there's a history that causes all this. You know, it's not in the air and it's not genetics or anything like that. But when a kid pulls out a baseball bat and smashes the head of a friend, you have to put Jim Crow over here, and you have to say, you just have to be dealt with by society. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I saw a lot of that. And so
How long did you work in that position?
oh, I don't know, maybe I was a young guy, maybe a year and a half. What happened was, I was the head of the unit. We had about 34 lawyers, but the state legislature, the people up there heard about me, saw me in action, and offered me a job as the head of the staff of the Family Court Committee of the New York State Assembly. So I switched from being a litigator to being a halfway policy guy. And that was, sort of how my career shifted.
And was that in Albany, or you could do that from New York City?
You would do it from New York City and go to Albany once a month,
I see.
which was, in those days especially, just fine. There was one restaurant up there. There weren't a lot of restaurants in those days. Albany was Nelson Rockefeller hadn't finished making state government big. And then the follow-up governors and legislatures hadn't finished making it even bigger. But in those days, there weren't a lot of even restaurants or hotels. It was really a small town.
Mhm.
So I didn't have to go that often.
So what was the most interesting thing you worked on for that commission and that legislative body?
So I wrote the model legislation for juvenile court, family court handling of child abuse cases. So the version of the legislation I wrote became the federal model, partly because I became the director of the federal agency, and so I used my own model, but it became the model for how to adjudicate cases nationwide.
And what are some of the highlights of that model?
Well, two things I'd mention. The first is to get a little bit away from, or to apply some of the realities of social science. So, for example, if a parent kills one child, you don't start from scratch on thinking about the danger a second child faces. You don't make it you make it a rebuttable. We made it a rebuttable presumption, not that you couldn't prove that it wasn't true, just that the court could take jurisdiction based on what you had done to another child. And the other thing, which I think helped me leave the field, was that very much concerned about the overreach of these child abuse and child neglect cases, the rhetoric. A lot of these families are poor, and their child rearing practices are a function, are more properly labeled poverty related than some kind of mental health related. And I pushed that real hard. When I was the director of the National Center, I pushed it a lot. And that was not a popular position with the social work world. And so I became somewhat controversial because, again, I was a root causes guy.
And just, we'll come back to some of your later jobs, but with regard to this point, seems as if the world has moved in your direction, maybe even too far, or has it on these kind of cases?
Yes and no. It has, in some respects, it's become, the attempt is, so it's quite striking. If you look at the cases that come before our courts nationwide, they are really disproportionately Black families, much less than brown families, almost no Asian families, and so forth. So there is a social aspect to this as well as an economic and so forth. We still take in, I think, something like 2 or 3 million reports a year. And you see some of these reports, their children are really just free-range children and so forth. You see, I can't speak for you guys, but we thought nothing of leaving our child. It's been a number of years. Our children are quite old, so I don't think I could be put in jail. But we thought nothing of leaving our sleeping child in bed in our suburban neighborhood and walking around the block for 15 minutes, right? That's now considered a form of child neglect.
Wow.
And, so it's in all directions. There is some sensitivity to over-reporting, over-definitions. And also there's a strong, how would you put it, anti-racialized or a desire to see some of this as being racial discrimination. That's a really complicated subject. It is surely the case that there are different standards. But my own experience is that the standards in suburban areas are much tougher than in urban areas. That in urban areas, it's that what we call child abuse is a much higher, it requires a much higher level of activity, partly because, well, it's not that common, but it's closer to a social norm. And it's extremely difficult for single mothers to raise kids on their own. It's just tough. And with the neighborhoods providing such negative context for how the kids grow up, it's just tough. And I'm just sorry we haven't, addressed it in a more, for me, more sophisticated way. Don't ask me how I would do it, but yeah, there you are.
So now you transitioned to DC to join this national center, or how did that happen?
Well, I always tell my students, you never know what your next job is going to be. So, always comb your hair and wash your hands and clean your fingernails. This is important. So I was perfectly happy in New York. We had a great apartment. Used to be able to bicycle down to work. The West Side Highway had fallen apart, but you could bike on it. This shows you how far back this goes. So I was perfectly happy, but I was invited to the first national conference on child abuse. And the people from HEW, that's what it was then, had helped fund it, and they were there. And they saw this smart aleck lawyer, and they said, he'd be a great person to be the director of the National Center on Child Abuse. All right, says I. I said to my wife, you want to move to Washington? She's got a career. We have a lot of friends. But, it looked like a good job. So we made a deal. It would be the only move we'd make for me, and she could have a move too. But we never moved, and that was 50 years ago.
Yeah. And how long were you running that center?
Maybe 2.5 or 3 years. But I got fired, as I hinted. Yeah, they promoted me up. It was a civil service job, so they couldn't get rid of me. They had to move me up. But I turned out to be a little too controversial. You see, you're supposed to say child abuse is a disease. We need mental health people. We need to mental health these people. At least in those days, that's what it was like. And we have to increase every reporting. You report a child if you have a gut feeling. This was the rhetoric. If you have a gut feeling that a child is being abused or neglected, report that child.
Mhm. And so you moved up to what?
I was deputy commissioner, and I didn't have a lot to do.
Mm.
One of my jobs was to review draft regulations for the department, and my job was to make them gender neutral.
Mm.
So this was a long time ago, and so I can still tell you about firefighters instead of firemen, and it goes on from there.
Yeah, and you would use artificial intelligence today.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, yeah.
So you're at HEW, and then what happens?
So then I went to Brookings, because I really just couldn't do that anymore, and I had a book in me that I wanted to write and so forth. So I went to Brookings for a few years and learned some of the skills of policy analysis. I should go back and say that at HHS, I ran both a policy shop and an evaluation R&D shop. So I learned a lot about evaluation on the job. And I mention that because after Brookings, I've basically been teaching, and I've been teaching both policy analysis, which I learned kind of at Brookings, and I teach program evaluation, which I learned kind of at the HHS when I was doing child abuse research. Yeah, I probably learned a little bit more since then, I hope. But that's how. So I've had, as you suggested in your introduction, a variegated experience.
Yeah. And well, Brookings must have been fun. There are a lot of bright people there and thoughtful people.
It was a very exciting place, very exciting time, much smaller than it is today, much more oriented towards 50,000-foot research. But things were changing. I won't name names, but one of the senior fellows wanted to do a book on religion and politics. And the Brookings board said, religion has no place in politics. Why would you possibly want to do a book on that?
Mm-hmm.
It took that person a few years to get the board to finally say yes. Somebody else who had a sterling academic background wanted to do a book on the birth, growth, and decline of bureaucracies, especially government bureaucracies. And the theory was they were something like organic organisms, whatever you call them.
Yeah.
And you could explain a lot of what we observe if you use that paradigm. And they basically refused. This was a very senior, and the board didn't. I'm not trying to be critical. It's just that new thinking can be difficult. Anyway, it was a great time there. I worked with people I had a lot of respect for. I learned a lot. And
a lot of good economists there.
Well, you would mention that. Yeah. Well, I was in a group that didn't have too many economists.
Okay.
we were in the social, whatever it was called.
What would
Politics.
you regard as the most important issue that you tackled in your job at Brookings?
I wrote my book called Recognizing Child Abuse when I was there. And
Okay,
that was this book that said, don't get carried away. You know, it's a serious problem, do this and do that. And then I started getting involved in this was the beginnings of all ferment about welfare reform and so forth. So I started learning about that. But my main thing that I did there was write this book and a series of articles. That's when I wrote my first articles about it. It's not what I call it. It's not crime, you know, it's poverty, stuff like that. It's not child abuse, it's poverty. That was actually the name of one of my pieces. So it made me real popular in the field. But I learned. It was more like a sponge. As Bob mentioned, I was just trying to be defensive about or protective of our little group. There were a group of very fine economists there. Whether they could do some kind of fancy regression analysis, who knows? But they were right. But they were very wise people, and they had a sense of how economies worked. There was, I think they still do it now, but I haven't been there for 20 odd years. They had something called a Friday lunch, and Joe Peckman chaired it. And they had, we were only 20 people around the table, maybe 25, but every week they have some very special luminary. And it was a serious conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell you
So-
what, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So at that point, is it at that point that you transitioned to AEI, American Enterprise Institute? How did that come about?
So I taught in Canada for a year. I taught in Virginia for a year, William and Mary. I would have taken, if I had been able to get a full-time teaching job then, I probably would have taken it. But I got an offer from AEI, which was a much more mixed institution in those days. I think half of us were Democrats. So I went to AEI and I ended up there for 20-something years. Yeah.
Mm.
Teaching part-time on the side, first at Georgetown and then at Maryland. Yeah, so I was at AEI for a long time.
And at AEI, could you do kind of a lot of what you wanted, or did you have to raise funds for projects, or how did it work?
Everything's different and everybody's deal is a little different, not just at AEI, but everywhere. You know, I think better than most, Bob, about what places like AEI, Brookings, and Urban are like, where you are. It probably, I'm not sure what would have been the case for me. I tended to raise money, but I had a named chair for the last 10 years that I was there. So that made it a little more relaxing. The basic deal in the old days was you were paid at least for a couple of years. But if you wanted a research staff, you had to raise money for the research staff. And so the model really was, it was a very funny model. At Brookings, if you just wanted to write your own book, Gil Steiner was the last person at Brookings who had tenure. Because if you've ever looked at the Brookings email address, it's brookings.edu.
EDU, yes.
And so it used to have students and tenured faculty. There was nothing like that at AEI. but all I want to paint with a very broad picture. There are places now that are called think tanks that are basically mission driven. They believe in either constraining this or expanding that, and they raise money to do that. At AEI, when I was there, I got to work on what I wanted to, and I got to take any position I wanted to take. I mean, the president of AEI once asked me, did you really have to have a conference on why men wear condoms? And when I explained to him what the issues were around that, and this was at the height of the HIV epidemic, but it also had to do with cheating on your wife and so forth and so on. Anyway, he understood it a little bit more, but I got to do stuff like that. I did a little bit of child support enforcement. I did a lot of child welfare, and I did a lot of welfare reform, which was and incomes and race. I wrote a bunch about race and marriage and families.
Yeah. And so I want to transition a little, because we don't have a whole lot of time, to your effort after you became a professor at the University of Maryland. See, folks, I already know a lot about Doug, but anyway, and you're teaching there, and your European projects. So please tell our listeners about how you got involved in European social policy and European efforts, and maybe we could talk a little bit about some of those ideas stemming from that.
Sure. Well, there is a major give and take between Europe and the US. Not so much between, and somewhat between the US and Korea. There was more, because in part there are a lot of US trained faculty in Korea. There was a lot of interaction before the current atmospherics between the US and China. So there are these lines of communication. Notice not as much in my experience with Latin America, not so much with Africa and Southeast Asia. Europe is if the US is 50 states with a strong national government, Europe is whatever you want to say, 25, 35, whatever number you want to pick, countries with a weak national or supranational government, the European Union. And so that creates a very interesting difference in analysis. We get a good idea, like what I did, child abuse. And all of a sudden the federal government says every state should do that. You get an idea about child support to take your area, and all of a sudden every state should do that. The result is a flattening. You don't have any more of the outliers that are really good and outliers that are really poor. In Europe, it is still very much the case that these are individual countries. Now, a lot of them are smaller than New York City. Oh, Norway. Well, Norway counts as a country, right? Well, we in New York would say, yeah. There are more Norwegians in Minneapolis, right? And then in Norway or something. I don't know. So the difference is that you get interesting reflections on policy. One that I'll mention to you is minimum wage, where we have a national minimum wage with the states able to raise it, but not below, and so forth and so on. There, you have Germany, and not just Germany, but you have Frankfurt and so forth, that if you were going to do a minimum wage, and for years they didn't have one, you'd have a high one. And then you have Slovakia, where you'd have a much lower minimum wage, sort of like in my own view about this, in New York, you have a minimum wage for New York City and a different minimum wage for upstate New York, especially the small counties. So you can see those kinds of differences worked out in Europe. People think the Europeans are the social democrats, that just want to give every poor person money. I mean, it's Bernie Sanders, right, seems to, have a view of Scandinavia that was from the 1950s. Those countries are tougher on non-work than we are by a ton. They're much more authoritarians, not something. Anyway, there are variations. I'm making a long story here because he asked a big question. There are enough variations so that you can learn a different version of what we do. And that's good intellectually by itself, but it's also lessons that we can apply in the US.
Now, you got more involved to actually create courses and so on. How did that happen?
Yeah. So because I knew people there and because I knew of the options and so forth, at the University of Maryland, I teach 2 courses in Europe. One is on program evaluation and policy analysis, and we do that in association with the OECD and the European Commission. So we take students over there. It's a regular course. They spend 10 days in Paris, maybe 8 days in Paris, and a couple of days in Brussels, where the European Union meets, and in Luxembourg, where the other EU agencies are. And they learn how the EU agencies did a program work. They learn how the European agencies plan. And then I teach a course on program management, and we do that in Rome and in Florence or Milan. And that's a course on how European agencies manage programs. And at least for the last 10 years, the Europeans do a loads better job than we do. Your viewers may know, listeners may know, that we probably lost $500 billion in fraudulent claims as part of the pandemic spending. The Europeans lost almost none because they had much tighter administrative controls. So, for example, we had people in Europe stealing Social Security numbers and getting unemployment checks. And we couldn't do anything about it. We did not have the wherewithal. Well, in Europe, most of the countries, they knew how to identify a suspicious IP address and just wouldn't send anything there. So there are loads of things that the Europeans do better than we do, and we can learn from them. There are some things we do that we can learn. So the students love it. They also love being in Paris and Brussels and Rome and Milan. And so do I. The food's good and so forth and so on. But I do learn a lot, and we work with the local agencies. And it's something that ought to happen more. And what makes it more interesting than, for example, taking a group of students to Sacramento or Albany or so forth, is our system, and now I'm being a little bit political here. Our system now is as much about, in my world, what do we do to satisfy the federal government? As opposed to what do we do that's right? I mean, I'm going to make an assertion and you're a host, but you can say, no, that's not true. Child support enforcement, and the states are just the tools of the federal agencies. They may not be perfect tools. There may be a lot of problems, but it's not like they say, all right, let's have a new child support system. They are basically implementing a federal system. Is that fair, Bob? I don't mean to.
Yeah, it's broadly fair, and I think it's interesting. You might be interested in the fact that the person that got this going in a big way was a Southern Democrat from Louisiana, conservative, by the name of Russell Long, who also is the father of the Earned Income Tax Credit. So out of a conservative Democrat that even liberal Republicans did not agree with for the most part, two of our biggest social policy innovations came from him. He was mostly interested in Social Security, but he was interested in that. But yeah, I think we did have a huge, not only child support collection problem, but a huge problem in identifying paternity, who was the actual legal father. And it took years to move that process to the point where that is far less of a problem than it used to be.
Yeah, but my point is only, yeah, but I do want to make a technical point here. And I think it's a point about regulation in general. Z, I don't know if you agree or not. But the natural state of affairs, or the default state of affairs, is something like either a bell curve or just a lot of variation from an average. And what we do is by nationalizing issues, we narrow that spread. I think that's right. At least we tried to. The Europeans have this spread, right? Because they don't have a strong central. They can't
Well,
even.
doesn't the European Commission try to narrow the spread a lot on a lot of things?
Well, it's. You want another hour here? I'll talk. No, but anyway. So they have a couple of concepts. One is called value added, and they're supposed to ask the following question: does EU action add enough to the quality or whatever of this program that we should impose it continent-wide? In other words, do the benefits outweigh the costs? We never do that. I mean, it's, if you can get a congressman to say, let's do this, and you get, and he or she sticks it in a bill. So now they're not perfect. Don't hear me saying that at all, but they do have to answer that question, which puts a different burden. And there are some things that are out of their competence. So they don't have the legal authority to create a minimum wage. They simply don't. Now they can provide a guidance, and they can say, we think states should. Now, one thing that I'm very involved in now is cash transfers, universal basic incomes and all that. The EU does not have the authority to impose that. So it issued a statement last year saying, we think it's a good idea. And some governments will say, oh yeah, good, we'll try it. Some, no. So the variation, I want to say, so I'm playing to Z here. And this is like when a market has a lot of ups and downs and you can make some money because you can play the variations. I think I got that right, Z?
Yeah, you can make arbitrage profits.
Yeah. So I can make teaching profits.
Right.
Right. Because I can see these differences. And since I don't have a vested interest, I hope, in any of them, it becomes easier to teach. And it's not like, well, you see, these people just don't know, right? Why don't they just do it our way? You can somewhat see the reasons why they do it a little differently.
So, Doug, we're near the hour. Let's just get your view on Doug. He's maybe too modest to say that he was the president of the Association for Public Policy and Management. He got some new awards going for people that did very good things statistically and other ways when he was president. But where do you see some of our gains in policy, and where do you see where we're falling super short?
Oh, gosh. In
5 minutes.
Yeah. So I've become quite disheartened about that. You can maybe see our traditional policy analytic tools and evaluation tools used on small problems that don't have a political constituency. But it's more than just our polarization. We've become very politically oriented. Part of it is driven by a long ignored sensitivity to race. And I appreciate that. Notice I said long ignored, and it shouldn't have been. But part of it is also politics. And our younger generation just doesn't believe and trust what the old people have to say. So it's a very unsettled world. It's not just Donald Trump, and I'll name names now, who seems to be oblivious to policy analysis. Let's use the APAM lingo. But it does seem as if the Biden people as well. I mean, it just seems to be driven by politics, by the accretion of voters. For me, it's very depressing. I think it was Hitler who said, how many troops does the Pope have? Or how many divisions does the Pope have? And I know that's not exactly the right fit, but it's a little bit like that, which is if you don't have an army behind you to fight for child support enforcement, you need troops. You need more than analysis. And for somebody my age, I'm too old a dog to be taught new tricks. So I've become much more cynical about those kinds of things. And I don't know how we get back to those kinds of things, to that kind of analysis. So that's less than 5 minutes, but I think that's the biggest challenge. And in class, I often have young people tell me, not even so young anymore, but I have people say, I don't care what the data show. I believe ... And they may be right. Let me say this again. They may be right, but it's tough to teach this old dog new tricks.
Yeah. Well, Tzvi, you have something to offer here. I think one of the big problems, which certainly relates to your research, Tzvi, is on the deficit and the debt.
If we're talking about policy and policy analysis, I am concerned also about the politicalization increasing and obliviousness to what the data show. Although, there is the potential upside of artificial intelligence to help us do analysis better. But
I think you're right, and I share your optimism. But so before you close, so I testified before the House Ways and Means Committee a couple of months ago, and no one, but especially not the Democrats, but no one particularly cared about the deficit, particularly cared about spending more money than we had. Because let's face it, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've been doing that and there's been no cost. Now there's a little bit of cost. I think interest rate payments now are higher than whatever, the Pentagon or whatever. So maybe they'll get taught something here. But the atmosphere that I see on the Hill is oblivious to spending levels.
Yeah. Well, we see that, but anyway, Doug, you've had an interesting career. We want to thank you for sharing it with our people. Maybe you can share it with your own family and friends.
And I thank you too.
A lot of new things I learned about you, especially if I have, today you buy a new television, you don't repair the old one. but that was interesting to hear your technician expertise to go along with all the rest of your expertise. So thank you very much. And we always close with one phrase. Zvi,
Sei gesund.
sei gesund.
Gesund. That means be well.
Thank you. You too. Great fun, great pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye.